So thank you so much, Nam, for that very generous introduction. I learned a lot about myself in that narrative. And it's really a pleasure to be back here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I spent 2 of the best summers of my life here as a CIASI student studying Vietnamese in 2002 and 2004. So it's really nice to be back in Madison, and great to be here at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I've been following the dynamic programming that you have been offering over the years, and also the growth of the Asian American Studies program here. And so it's really nice to kind of, that I appreciate that these 2 programs have co-sponsored this talk. And also great to know that COTS is being sponsored here in two weeks. We're going to have a band from NIU coming up here. So hopefully you'll be able to welcome my colleagues very soon. So the title of my paper today is Appropriating Assimilation and Automobility, Vietnamese American Refugee Resettlements and Refusals. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about some of the recent work that I've been conducting on transnational Southeast Asian migration and subsequent Asian American community formations. I'll focus on domestic movements and connections between Vietnamese Americans in particular in the US Northeast, the Midwest, the South, and California. My analysis draws on ethnography, oral histories, archives, and diaspora cultural productions. Many of the images that I will present today are from former refugee camp archives, or shared with me in the process of conducting oral histories, or taken during fieldwork for this project. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to discuss resettlement processes that were intended to disperse and assimilate Southeast Asian refugee arrivals in 1975, and how these policies were resisted and circumvented in various ways through secondary migration. In the second half of the talk, I will try to slow down and ethnographically dwell on the connective affordances of the automobile in particular, as a particularly important and often overlooked tool that can help us to understand how some of these processes of secondary migration and community formation have unfolded. Okay, so let's begin. As this audience here at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies is very well familiar, Southeast Asians, including Vietnamese, Cambodians, Lao, and Hmong, were originally resettled in the US, mostly as refugees after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, facilitated by the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act. At the time, refugees from South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were intentionally scattered throughout all 50 states as part of a dispersion policy that was intended to assimilate newcomers to American society. In a letter to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld at the time, one analyst likened the approach to, quote, scattering individual refugees like sand through the entire nation, unquote. Now, you can imagine that there were drawbacks to this national dispersion policy, as resettled refugees were already traumatized from war and forced exodus, attempted to navigate atomized lives in new environments, often with limited transportation and housing options, and unfamiliar climates. They did this furthermore without strong ethnic or social support networks to fall back upon. I think it's worth noting that this dispersion model, while in many ways misinformed, was not necessarily new. In fact, it was applied with parallel logic after World War II in the resettlements of formerly interned Japanese Americans who were encouraged to not return to the West Coast, from which they were removed in 1942. When Japanese Americans were released from the camps 2 to 3 years later, they were expected to amalgamate, in one planner's words, to primarily Caucasian communities in other parts of the country. As President Franklin Roosevelt remarked in 1944, he wanted to avoid what he called social discombobulation in resettling this Japanese American population back into the general populace. Scattering 75,000 Japanese all around the United States, in his words, was not going to upset anyone. The War Relocation Authority model oddly remained on the books 30 years later as a rough guide to help organize and resettle the sudden influx of Southeast Asian refugees in April 1975, as described by one former mental health worker who was working at Camp Pendleton. And this included the political and cultural rationales for dispersion. As one planner at the time noted, the mistake in the 1960s had been to forget the perceived structural benefits of assimilation. In the 1970s, there was a determination to not create another Miami, which referred to the concentrated resettlement of Cuban refugees there following Castro's rise to power on the island in 1959. And yet, even after the Ford administration created multiple incentives for states, local governments, and voluntary agencies to facilitate refugee sponsorship locally, the reception of Southeast Asian refugees by war-weary Americans was lukewarm at best. One Catholic cleric who advocated for Southeast Asian refugee sponsorship pled that these were, quote, beautiful people who would be resettled in beautiful ways. In other words, quietly and spread out in such a way that Americans would not necessarily notice or complain. Some of the initial resettlement cities for Southeast Asians included places like Des Moines, Iowa, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Utica, New York, Dorchester, and Springfield, Massachusetts, where this picture is from, and Hartford, Connecticut, supported by agencies such as Catholic Charities and Lutheran Social Services. As you can see from this Office of Refugee Resettlement document for Cambodian refugees, even in 1989, there was generally a push for resettlement to mostly smaller and less diverse municipalities, such as Lowell, Alabama, and Lincoln, Nebraska. And as you can imagine, some of these places were not the most conducive for establishing new lives in America. This is a picture of Seadrift, Texas, where a number of Vietnamese resettled as fishermen in the late 1970s. Only to be quickly attacked by the KKK, who resented them for encroaching on their ways of life and livelihoods. There are still a few Vietnamese families in this small town, but many of the original population have since moved away. In general, within a decade of the start of post-1975 refugee resettlement, many Southeast Asians in the US had left towns and states of original resettlement to move, often to warmer climates with significant Asian population centers, a process that sociologists have called secondary migration. In particular, as you can see from this map, they chose California. Here on the right is a picture of the original Little Saigon in Orange County, California, just outside of Los Angeles. The automobile, which was oftentimes one of the early material purchases or acquisitions of refugee families, and pictures of which circulate significantly in early letters that were sent by refugees back to family in their homeland, contributed significantly to the secondary migration process. I will be focusing on Vietnamese American automobility during the second part of my talk, but before we get there, let's understand a bit more about how this started and spread. In the archives of at least 3 of the 4 Southeast Asian refugee receiving camps in the US, Camp Pendleton, California, Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, one finds significant evidence about the emphasis on teaching driving as a quintessential life skill for refugees' future American survival and self-sufficiency. And these are just some pictures from the archives in Fort Chaffee of these clunky driving machines that were used to help people learn how to drive. The camps were open for a relatively short period of time, from April 1975 until about December 1975. And so there was an emphasis on kind of conveying basic life skills before people moved on to more permanent resettlement. As refugees from primarily Vietnam and Cambodia at the time were sponsored out of their camps, the first challenge was learning to navigate complex and often limited public transportation systems in order to make their way to work and school. As one Vietnamese former refugee shared, originally resettled in Springfield, Massachusetts, but now living in Southern California, learning the bus map was one of the first tasks of American life. Eventually, many would learn to drive and pool money to buy a used car. Driving lessons continued to be popular for new immigrants, in turn sponsored by earlier waves of refugees. One Vietnamese American woman who runs a driving school now in Houston, Texas, says that she helps Vietnamese in the area study and memorize for the written driving test as what she considers to be a service to her community. The automobile, in turn, opened up the possibility of resettlement in sprawling, suburban, car-centric landscapes that were often quite different from the small urban downtowns that many Southeast Asians had first learned to navigate by bus. In this slide, you see the original Little Saigon developed around Frank Zhao's 1986 construction of the Phuc Loc Tho Mall in Orange County, California. Over here. Little Saigon represents one of the most significant reconstitutions of Southeast Asian ethnic communities after the war. It's a sprawling suburban area of broad boulevards, shopping centers, and tract housing built on former agricultural and pastoral land. It is now the largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam, and over the years has become the standard reference point for Southeast Asian American communities elsewhere. Little Saigon was first designated in 1988, bringing together parts of two separate cities, Westminster and Garden Grove, that had large Vietnamese populations. Its naming was a celebratory moment for many Vietnamese who had fought to establish their visibility in what was traditionally seen as white farm and cattle ranch country, John Wayne country, and the still vivid memories of older Orange County residents. Little Saigon continues to be a especially aspirational model for many other emerging Vietnamese communities seeking recognition through naming. Here you see a sign indicating the Little Saigon developed in San Jose, California, just south of San Francisco. This is the second largest Vietnamese community in the country, and there was a lot of divisive protests about this. And the original proposed name was Saigon Business District. People called for the resignation of Madison Nguyen, who was the Vietnamese politician that represented them, and eventually Little Saigon prevailed. There was pushback against this name because of the anti-communist politics of the diaspora, but this naming has been really significant. Little Saigon, now since the 2000s, there's been a third wave of migration to southern sunbelt metropoles in particular. This has been fueled by new migration, both directly from Vietnam, as well as by many Asian Americans who feel priced out of the California housing market. So in that previous map that I showed you, you may have noticed that after California, Texas also had a significant Vietnamese population. Now the third largest in the country and the second largest by state. And yet much less has been written about Vietnamese in Texas, or other states for that matter, than in California, despite those processes of migration being driven by similar structural dimensions and personal motivations. In 2021, the Vietnamese American newspaper, Noi Viet, reported that around 700,000 people have moved to Texas from California since 2010. Of those, many are third-wave Asian American migrants that are intentionally deciding to settle in Asian ethno-burbs. The term ethno-burb is a concept that geographer Wei Li has used for suburbs outside of major urban centers, characterized by influxes of particular ethnic communities. In the Houston metro area, where the majority of Vietnamese now live in ethno-burbs rather than the city proper, the number of Vietnamese has gone from 9,000 in 1980 to 32,000 by 1990, and in 2020, 143,000. Many Vietnamese American residents talk about the familiarity of Houston's hot, humid environment, in some ways not dissimilar to Saigon, and how they've been able to purchase new houses and use the savings from perhaps the sale of a previous home in California as startup capital to start businesses such as restaurants or nail salons and hair salons. Third wave, the new immigration communities, as opposed to first wave refugee resettlers, are generally characterized by dispersed suburban transportation and real estate landscapes. The availability of cheaper and undeveloped land also affords more materially visible expressions of ethnic and cultural identities. And this includes the kinds of large temples, churches, and shopping centers that often reflect Asian architectural styles that are becoming more commonplace along thoroughfares, such as the Buford Highway outside of Atlanta, Georgia, or Delaware Boulevard outside of Houston. These developments are in many cases more materially visible even than some of the little Saigons in California, where land is much more expensive. Here, for example, is the recently opened Holy Vietnamese Martyrs Church in Norcross, Georgia, modeled after the 19th century Phat Siem Cathedral in northern Vietnam that combined Western and Asian architectural styles. The construction for the cathedral was fundraised for years and strategically built right off Interstate 85 in Norcross near Atlanta so that it would be easily visible from the highway. Now, the centrality of politics to community visibility remains widespread. This includes the politics of memory and loss. As new little Saigons establish themselves, one sees parallel memorializations of Vietnamese refugee political and social pasts. These two monuments remember veterans of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, here on the right, and they're both refugee exodus over there on the left, and is prominently displayed in a shopping center on Delaware Boulevard in the heart of Houston's Little Saigon district. Here, ethno-mobile placemaking is directly related to memories of displacement and refusals to forget. I use the term displacemaking to reframe the activities and processes that have contributed to these community formations and attempts to adapt or assimilate. Memorials such as these are sites of annual gatherings to commemorate Black April on April 30th. April 30th is the anniversary of the fall of Saigon and the loss of country, Matnuk, or here on the banner, Kokan, which literally means Day of National Shame. This photo was taken in Houston during a gathering on April 30th, 2024. In these processes of community building, a Saigon of half a century past, and the little Saigons that have budded around the country, starting in California, become sources of mnemonic and aesthetic reference. Anthropologist Lisa Mulkey, interviewing Hutu refugees in Tanzania, noted how the plight of exiled refugees connected to histories of and obstacles to movement and agency contribute to what she terms mythico-collective histories and identity orientations. The irony for the Vietnamese American community, as Asian American studies scholar An Nguyen has noted, is that an increasingly significant segment of the Vietnamese diaspora no longer has direct or indirect connections to the former Saigon political regime. Nguyen estimates that in Houston alone, there are at least 10,000 relatively recent Vietnamese immigrants who hail directly from 21st century northern Vietnam, whose experiences of trans-Pacific mobility do not necessarily fit with the South Vietnamese refugee-centric displacement narrative. Certainly, when I was teaching at the University of Houston, there were many Vietnamese students who come directly from Vietnam, and this graph kind of demonstrates the significant rise in Vietnamese international students over the years, which now are in the top 10 countries of countries sending students to the U.S. We'll see how that goes in the future with all the new policies. Nonetheless, the process of symbolically whirling little Saigons around a displaced refugee origin story becomes a point of mutual recognition or misrecognition, as the case may be. As the anthropologist Clifford Geertz argued long ago, culture revolves around the collective production and accepted recognition of shared community symbols that orient them to a system of meaning. These systems of meaning are cultivated and maintained in shared community spaces. Here you see a picture of one of the Vietnamese community centers in the Asiatown neighborhood of Bel Air, Houston. And as you can see, prominently displayed in front of it is the Republican yellow flag with the 3 red stripes. This is not the current flag of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. In the background here, you can see the current flag, the red flag with the yellow star. And by the way, if you ever come down to DeKalb, this is our Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and our Pottinger House, which is falling apart, but we were very fond of. And this is one of our cultural celebrations, but you can see that this flag is different, right? I have to explain that sometimes to audiences, but perhaps not this one. So in the early 2000s, there was a concerted and coordinated effort to introduce legislation in Vietnamese communities around the country, from Seattle to New Orleans to Northern Virginia, that established the former Republic of Vietnam flag as the official heritage and freedom flag of Vietnamese in the United States. The ubiquity of the flag across Houston is reflective of that history of collective and sometimes coerced community organizing around a shared symbol of Vietnamese refugee identity. Bel Air's Little Saigon reflects an in-between process of a longer durée out-migration from Houston city center, where Vietnamese communities originally congregated around the downtown. This is a falling apart building in the former Chinatown in Houston, which has been largely abandoned. It's right next to the Astros Stadium, so there's been a lot of displacement from that. And here you see the Mekong Center, which is in Midtown Houston. This is one of the first Southeast Asian-owned shopping plazas. And there's still a significant community around here, a lot of businesses. You see murals like this with a South Vietnamese flag and memories of the boat refugee exodus in the city skyline here. This is my research assistant, Anna, my daughter, who travels to many places with me. But now, many of the Vietnamese community are moving even further out from Midtown in Bel Air to places like Sugar Land, Texas, about an hour to an hour and a half outside the city center. And here you see some of the large temples, Buddhist temples that have been built, and which are afforded by the availability of land and space. You can see this picture here, where some of these temples are located, the kind of wide open space that's afforded the community to be able to build places that are more visible for their community. Meanwhile, some of the original Southeast Asian resettlement communities have emptied out, but others are increasingly inserting their longstanding presence. In Boston, you have the neighborhood of Dorchester, which held a naming ceremony for their Little Saigon business district a few years ago. Again, this Little Saigon moniker becomes really important. And the student researcher that I work with has documented the community efforts and divisive politics that took place in recognizing and naming this space, which often reveals underlying tensions between newer and older Vietnamese, in which sometimes exclusion can be as much the end result as the kinds of inclusiveness that such place namings are intended to celebrate. Whether one is included or excluded from local ethnic community politics, however, the infrastructural evidence of the Vietnamese in communities such as Dorchester or Hartford has been growingly apparent over the last decade. And part of what is enhancing the visibility of some of these communities is an influx of new money. Many Southeast Asian neighborhoods in the United States are characterized and shaped by remittance flows. This is a well-known fact, and it was the topic of my first book. Over 16 billion US dollars are now remitted annually from the Vietnamese diaspora to Vietnam, and about 70% of that originates in the United States. But increasingly, such financial flows do not necessarily travel only in one direction from the US to Asia. Rather, there are significant bidirectional movements of finance that are often facilitated by a variety of formal and informal services. You have halalist out services where bookkeeping techniques are used to basically record the money going back and forth, which avoids the actual bank transfer and the fees associated with that. The necessity of having bidirectional flows of money is driven also in part by EB-5 immigrant investor visas. And EB-5 immigrant investor visas in the past meant that you invest about $1 million and create 10 jobs, and that paves a pathway to get a green card. And here you can see that Vietnamese are number 3 in EB-5 visa recipients after China and India, and just ahead of South Korea. And of course, there are many other incentives that fuel the growth of these new ethnic business landscapes as well. But you're likely to see this grow. You may have heard that Donald Trump wants to replace the green card with a gold card and raise that investment amount even higher to $5 million. Facilitating these two-way flows has been challenging for a significant sector of ethnic remittance providers in a broader political context in which they've had to adapt to changing financial regulatory oversight, including going back to anti-laundering legislation following 9/11, the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, and now, starting in 2026, a 1% tax that will be imposed on outward bound remittances from the United States. Nonetheless, these trans-Pacific flows emanating from Asia to the US have helped to shape the aesthetic landscape of many Asian American communities, from Queens, New York, to Bel Air, Texas, to Schaumburg, Illinois. And so I would argue that is in many ways no longer the traditional downtown Chinatowns, but rather suburban ethnic neighborhoods where some of the most energetic Asian American community developments are now underway. Emergent business, transportation, and real estate development patterns in these ethno-burbs become gauges to examine new forms of economic agency and the production of Asian American community landscapes. Placemaking, however, is entangled with complex pasts and futures. So placemaking is entangled with complex pasts and futures. Yidang Trung described what she called refugee world-making as the labor of challenging, transforming, asserting, and carving out ways of living. One salient example of how such agental worldly labors are connectedly enacted and how they have affected the aesthetics of the landscape that contribute to building is, as I suggested at the beginning of this talk, the automobile. Now, the utilitarian appropriation of this classic American symbol is particularly interesting to me. In fact, just last night at my hotel in Madison, I came back and there were all these classic cars in the parking lot. So I thought I'd take a picture and share with you. And think about in America how classic the symbol of the American car is. And this was just a convoy of people who had classic cars who were driving all around the country, and they just happened to be staying at the same hotel. So I threw that in there for fun. But the utilitarian appropriation of this American symbol is, I think, quite interesting. So in the second half of this talk, I want to slow down in order to ethnographically dwell a bit and tell some stories about the role of the car itself as expressed in oral histories and cultural productions in order to demonstrate the automobile's contribution to processes of Vietnamese American displacement. And so I'm going to leave this picture of the backseat of a car packed with a family that was just leaving Camp Pendleton in December 1975 as I go through some of the stories here. Automobiles often provided immigrants their first and most accessible tool for agentic mobility. And as I mentioned before, learning to use them was a concerted emphasis for refugee camp life skill training workshops. Indeed, automobiles are frequently recalled by many Vietnamese immigrants as one of their first significant purchases or sometimes gifts. And lots of creative stories about how people pooled money to be able to afford these cars, and how these cars, were really crappy and were always leaking oil, and so they had to learn how to fix them. So, it's a fascinating subject to explore. As one middle-aged Vietnamese American man who now lives in Houston shared, quote, "We arrived in Pennsylvania. It was so cold and lonely there. After 6 months, we saved up enough money and bought a used Oldsmobile. We packed everyone into that car and went everywhere, from work to school, as well as weekend family trips and picnics. Sometimes we'd even go to Philadelphia or Northern Virginia to get Asian groceries, but that was a bit far." Members from one Methodist church in Buffalo, New York, remembered how they had sponsored a Cambodian refugee family in 1980. And the congregation had raised contributions among the congregation to buy an old AMC Pacer for one of the families that the church had sponsored. Within a year of getting that Pacer, they recall the family picked up and left and moved to Long Beach, California. Another Vietnamese American, recalling her original life in Bridgeport, Connecticut, before her family moved to Southern California, talked about how isolation and living in survival mode prevented her from thinking for many years about her Vietnamese identity or history. She recalls, quote, "I was living in a place where there was no reflection or inkling of Vietnamese culture or community. So I basically created a new identity and tried to assimilate and adapt to this American identity. So that was an interesting transition. For a long time, I didn't really come to realize that my Vietnamese background or who I was very important. Eventually, her family saved enough, and with distant relatives in California as initial context, they packed up their belongings, along with her and her brother, and slowly drove across the country, visiting contacts along the way, and at least on a couple of occasions in her memory, slept together in the car at a highway rest stop. Cars were a tool of affordance, therefore, to not only move away from places of first resettlement, where maintaining a sense of ethnocultural identity was difficult and challenging, but also to actively choose where to move and to establish more vibrant cultural communities within those places, whether Long Beach for many Cambodians or Garden Grove for many Vietnamese. Bolsa Avenue, that now very busy Vietnamese boulevard stretching through the heart of Little Saigon, California, that I showed you a picture of earlier, was largely undeveloped in 1975. As ethnic businesses began to expand along the boulevard, Vietnamese began to seek housing, including in quickly assembled mobile home parks nearby. Recently, some of these trailer parks have been sites of Vietnamese community organizing and protests, as the gentrification of Southern California has led to further displacements of many lower income and often aging communities. As in Houston's Asia towns, displacement, this time as gentrification, maps onto a longer history of domestic dispersion in the US and displacement from Vietnam, including for many the double displacement of many 1954 north to south migrants, as well as the massive rural to urban exodus caused by South Vietnam's wartime insecurity. As Vietnamese settle and resettle again, what one witnesses eventual placemaking through the kinds of shopping malls, business districts, houses of worship, and even trailer parks that I've discussed. There's also the marking of Vietnamese suburban living through gardens, and this is a phenomenon that historian Roy Vu has written on and just published a book about. You can often mark Vietnamese households by the significant gardening outside of them. But over time, these markers may also be transient, as ghostly, once thriving Asian shopping centers or decaying, cheaply constructed housing are slowly abandoned for newer and greener pastures. Again, many of those greener real estate pastures are afforded by automobiles, which in turn, despite their intrinsic mobility, ironically sometimes also become stationary markers of place. Vietnamese Americans now count as one of the most suburban minority ethnic groups in the United States. In interviews, Vietnamese Americans in what might otherwise appear to be cookie-cutter, lower-income suburban neighborhoods explain how sometimes they can actually recognize the boundaries of their shared Vietnamese spaces by the kinds of cars that people drove and parked. Over time, Vietnamese have expressed clear brand preferences, often directed to Japanese cars such as Honda or Toyota, and aspirationally now to Tesla. In general, Asian Americans purchase Japanese cars in the highest proportion of any ethnic group. One middle-aged Vietnamese American man in suburban California shared with me how cars were a marker of identifying where the Asians in the neighborhood resided. He said, "See the Hondas and Toyotas on this block? That's because this is where the Vietnamese and Asians are. A few blocks over in that direction, you can see more Mexican and black families. There's more Chevys and Dodges in their driveways." Asian cars, of course, can be also marked by Vietnamese, as Vietnamese owned by the placement of cultural religious relics such as Buddhist or Catholic beads, charms, and images hanging off the front mirror, veteran mementos, and other decorative modifications. Automobiles and their role in transitioning from refugee to Asian American life, including the initial secondary migration processes that contributed to America's first Vietnamese American ethno-burbs, have been memorialized in numerous diasporic cultural productions. First-generation Vietnamese American author Jaden Nguyen, in his 1994 memoir about refugee flight from Vietnam and resettlement in New England, recalls, after a few years living in a small Vermont town, buying an old Pontiac with the little savings he had, packing up that car, and then driving at the end of his memoir towards a new unknown life in California. Over a generation later, the 2017 play Viet Cong by second-generation Vietnamese American playwright Queen Nguyen memorialized the experience of the secondary migration road trip. Journeying from Arkansas to California, the main character explores throughout the play changing relations to himself, his past, and his American future. In both, transportation indexes newfound refugee agency and imagining a new life that no longer depends on the burdensome original gift of freedom, as meaning Nguyen turns the reciprocal gratitude that many early Vietnamese refugees felt they were compelled to demonstrate to their sponsors. And here, this is a very typical picture of, church sponsorship was often a way out of the camps. Many who were in the camps had no choice but to be sponsored by churches, and those churches, in many ways expected reciprocity for the sponsorship that they gave them. As one woman now resettled in California recalled the burden of the assimilation expectations imposed upon her, she said, after the escape experience and sponsorship by the Lutheran Church in upstate New York, I always had to do everything I could to be accepted by other people. Now, I also, I've talked about the car here, but I also don't want to kind of overly romanticize this car equals agency narrative. Many people that I spoke with did not necessarily recall any grand cross-country road trips, which I can see are the kind of stories that capture my attention and that I've been wanting to uncover in my oral interviews. A number, and this is sometimes somewhat gendered, related matter-of-fact narratives about just getting on an airplane from cities like Cleveland, flying to Los Angeles, and getting picked up by family or friends there that would then introduce them to the Vietnamese community and help them guide them to establish new lives and livelihoods. In interviews, there's a lot of talk about how Vietnamese Americans have moved to places where there were opportunities to make money, and how they were able to learn new skill sets as well as return to old ones, as they also started to have more control over the jobs they could access, as English over time became a tool rather than a barrier. One woman who was originally resettled in Hartford, Connecticut, with little nostalgia now for the cold, the snow, and the ice, and having to navigate those city buses there, proudly shared with me how she moved to California and she was able to then open a Vietnamese restaurant in Orange County, which became very popular, and allows her to utilize her skills, but also share her culture and cuisine to a broader community. Nonetheless, in interviews that I've been conducting, cars do come up time and again, even if just in passing, as a critical tool to grab and connect the horns of navigating American life. And of course, for many stuck on the fringes of cities with limited access to transportation, the car can also become a symbol of a life inaccessible to many, especially older people who may not drive, catalyzing reflections on mobility exclusions as well. Even when one has a car, it can also be symbolic of the frustrating downward spiral of refugee life that some experience is not going or arriving anywhere, whether success in America or returning to Vietnam, as many aspire to do. Second generation memoirist and author Lê Thị Điềm Thuy, for example, reflects on her refugee father and the debilitation that he felt in his new American life, expressed in his relationship to his car. She describes in her book, quote, late at night, unable to sleep after having moved from his bed to the couch to 4 dining room chairs lined up in a row, he drives down to the beach and spins the car wheels in the wet sand, daring himself to drive into the sea. At daybreak, he drives the car home, parks at the edge of the driveway, lowers the seat, and falls asleep, exhausted, unquote. In the 1979 documentary film, one of the first documentaries about Vietnamese American refugee resettlement in the United States, called The Fonz of Jersey City, an unemployed young Vietnamese American man who lives in a household with 17 other Fon relatives, drives aimlessly around northern Jersey in his Ford. The skyline of Manhattan looms in the background, indexing a world that he is not a part of. As he steers the car through rundown neighborhoods, he talks with the filmmaker about his desires for a different life, revealing his underemployed frustration, exacerbated by a lack of fluent language and educational opportunity. he nonetheless insists that anything he's been able to achieve thus far in America has been by, quote, myself, without help from others. So I'd like to conclude now by reflecting how assimilation has been appropriated over time through the displace-making processes that I described. Displace-making helps us to conceptually rethink and comparatively analyze Southeast Asian domestic and transnational community formations, including how the assimilation agenda itself has been appropriated over time. Began in 1975, refugee resettlement policymakers did everything that they could to disperse Indo-Chinese refugees around the country. Refugees in the initial 4 camps of Pendleton, Chaffee, Indiantown Gap, and Eglin were not permitted to leave until they were sponsored by a family or community group elsewhere. Many requested to leave in what the camp administrators called flocks, but they were discouraged from doing so. They were prohibited from doing so, as this was against the federal guidance. Once families were finally resettled outside of the camps, social workers assigned to help them focus their efforts on cultivating economically stable, nuclear family-focused households. They prepared them to think about the future and forget the past, and they encouraged assimilation to mainstream American culture. In response, in many ways, the Vietnamese did everything but that. They insisted, even when their economic livelihoods were already marginal, on sending remittances back to their family in the homeland. As soon as they could, they sponsored extended relatives to move and live with them for indefinite periods, spanning months or sometimes years. As one man recalled, we moved to my uncle's apartment in California from the East Coast. The 4 of us, my family, we slept on the floor in the living room. We used to pile in the back of my uncle's car and go to the mall. We would walk around and look at things, but we couldn't buy anything because we couldn't afford it. I think most refugees who came to America feel very depressed at first. Our expectations were too high because we really didn't know what life was going to be like over there. What little resources early Vietnamese Americans were able to eventually accumulate, they typically pooled to buy plane or bus tickets or cars to move to other places with Asian populations, lured by stories of warm weather, jobs, marriage introductions, or more racial tolerance and acceptance. As they did so, these ethno-mobile agents appropriated the assimilationist agenda designed to sever ties, instead building new ethnic communities that referenced a lost homeland, as well as each other, dispersed over distant geographies in a large new country. Little Saigons dotted with yellow red stripes looked to Little Saigon, California, which ultimately remembered Saigon, South Vietnam, a capital and a nation state that no longer exists. And here on the left is a picture from the Lunar New Year Festival in Little Saigon. You see the imperial model of the imperial capital flag, and in front of it a bunch of South Vietnamese flags, therefore kind of indexing a hypothetical of what things might have been like had South Vietnam not fallen. And here is a picture of Saigon when it was the capital of South Vietnam back in the 70s. As Etienne Nguyen has argued, as part of the broader recent response to the critical refugee studies framework, has argued for the necessity of transnational lenses when it comes to analyzing Vietnamese American subjectivities. One must also understand the socio-political formations that pre-existed in South Vietnam and how these therefore implicitly shape refugee orientations and agential expressions when it comes to diasporic community organizing. Worlding, as Anani Roy and I Long have described it, is characterized by interreferencing. In the case of America's Little Saigons, Cambodia towns, and others, however, the original reference point is no longer a contemporaneous place. Collective meaning-making in such spaces is therefore elusively oriented to a temporal past and tangentially to a hypothetical, historical otherwise. And thus, the centrality of that yellow South Vietnamese Republican flag and the continued Black April remembrances in such Vietnamese American community formations. Ethno-mobile interreferencing conjures fragmented individual and collective memories and legacies of displacement interspersed with a recognition of the significance and agency of mobility for escaping and shaping one's fortune in life. Dreams of permanent return to the homeland deferred or abandoned, Vietnamese made their way to new communities around the country, strategically employing entrepreneurship and kinship networks to survive and sometimes to get ahead. economic success has varied, but mobility, if nothing else, has been a pathway for social reconnection and political expression. Examining the affordances and challenges of displaced making, whether in the details of entrepreneurship, real estate, or automobiles, provides important perspectives on the multi-layered trajectories of Vietnamese American refugee and immigrant aspiration, adaptation, and community formation, in which past and futures are entangled. The agencies that have been asserted over time are most apparent in their material manifestations, and the model minority myth encourages us to interpret Asian American success on the basis of US-centered economic well-being and social mobility. But the global circulations of Vietnamese bodies over the last 50 years have resulted in a now global diaspora that is widely dispersed from their starting points. The collective sense of feeling displaced from a source of unrequited origins has become spectrally significant to the Vietnamese American community's ongoing mobilities and orientations. The evolutions of Southeast Asian diaspora community formations across the US have undoubtedly turned out differently than the assimilation stay-in-place model that was once envisioned by 1975 refugee policymakers, but refused by refugees themselves, appropriating them instead towards new ends. So what I've gestured today throughout my talk is the importance of trying to solicit the transnational, but also domestic migration stories of how and why that came to be and are still becoming, not just once upon a time in Southeast Asia 50 years ago, but also over the last half century here in America and beyond as well. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.